Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paul. Okay, so we are going to do some role playing in this demonstration. So I should also say it's role playing that we haven't yet rehearsed. So we ask for your indulgence if things are not as slick as they might be. Okay, so okay.
Needs this one.
Let's see. Okay, cool. So I'm just gonna. I just have to press that one again.
Yeah, or you just heard this one.
No, that's a problem. It's not.
Okay.
Okay. No. Okay. So let me start by talking about the objective that the Mojaloop Foundation has in moving towards an ISO 20022 version of Mojaloop. Really, we want to extend the existing standard to meet the requirements of our inclusive instant payment systems in emerging economies. So we want to allow Mojaloop schemes to align with the global direction of payment definition, to align with the Nexus initiative, as we've just heard, for a cross-border standard. And eventually, we want Mojaloop systems to be able to participate directly in worldwide systems of payments. So where are we now? You probably got tired, those of you who attend these things regularly, of hearing me say, well, we produced a business justification and we sent it to the ISO organization and they said they've got some problems with it, but we're going to work through those problems and then everything will be fine. So I kind of wonder whether we might have gone too far too fast. So we started really by looking at the functional requirements of a Mojaloop system and map them onto the semantic field of the ISO 20022 message space. What I mean by that is that each ISO message has some narrative associated with it that said, this is what this message is supposed to represent. So where we didn't find equivalents, we proposed new equivalents. And that meant we were really asking the ISO organization to absorb a large number of new messages we proposed, and we proposed them all as part of a single business justification. So it's not really surprising that people are worried about the overall risk of change. And we're also worried too that they might make the wrong decisions about individual items because there are so many individual items in our business justification, and the interdependencies between them are quite hard to understand. So we thought we might look at taking a lower impact approach. And the purpose of this presentation is to explain to you what we think that lower impact approach might look like, and to ask you for comments, constructive criticisms, because I know there are no other kinds of criticisms in the Mojaloop community, and suggestions for improvement. So what we propose is that Mojaloop should use existing ISO 20022 messages where possible, and that's different from the semantic interpretation. So we're not just saying we will use messages where the ISO system says this message should do what you want to do. The structure of ISO messages, generally speaking, is inclusive. When new requirements appear, they appear as optional additions to the specification, not as replacements or new types of messages. And we can make them mandatory in our world via a market practice document, which is something which is under our control. It doesn't require approval from the ISO organization, though we will clearly register it with them. It doesn't require approval for us to adapt it and say, this is how we plan to use these messages. So the ISO 20022 approval process is less difficult for changes than it is for new messages. In particular, there's a whole level of approvals that you have to go through for a new message that you don't have to if all you want to do is change an existing message. So it's attractive from that point of view. And individual changes, change requests, can be submitted and actioned separately from each other. So people in the ISO organization can concentrate on an individual request without having to worry about how those requests relate to an overall subterfuge on our part. So what do we need?
Can I add perhaps if she's in,
Please
I'm
do.
not sure Is it working? Can you hear me in the back? Okay, great. So I think perhaps like, let's take one step back, like why ISO2022 and why it matters for Mojaloop per se, right? And I think perhaps we went a bit quickly on the first slide, and the purpose of Mojaloop is to create interoperability between various actors that deal with money, right? And if you look at the financial services industry, the ISO 222 is going to be the new global standard. So that's why, as like, you know, a payment system that want to be linked up with other instant payment system, the system needs to move to migrate to this format, so that then it's easier to connect with, with, for example, a system like Nexus and so on. Now, when it comes to the approach, originally, as Michael said, the idea was to introduce a new message type. But actually, like, was it really needed? This can be challenged. And reason for that is, again, like when you think in the context of interoperability, we should be able to use the existing message so that like the message can travel far. And when it comes to adding, actually going to the what Michael qualify as a lower impact approach, it means that on some of the requirements, we can actually like see across the industry if there is no other project or no other initiatives that have the same requirements. And then it becomes easier for the ISO 222 committee to accept these changes.
Thank you very much, Julie. Okay, so I'm just going to take a brief parenthesis to talk about what we need a payment to look like. So the problem is we have to take our customers where we find them. Generally speaking, choice between the account holding institutions that our customers use is very narrow, and it's based typically on geographical location. It's hard for them to change providers because it's hard for them to get to a new provider. Often there's only one provider that they can get to. And the institutions that they use may not look very much like the traditional idea of a bank. But that, we think, doesn't mean that with the proper support, those institutions can't play a productive part in a financial ecosystem. That's one of the fundamental messages, I think, that we live by as a community. So we need to provide the payment support that essentially enables people to reduce the risk and cost of reconciliation and remediation to zero, if we possibly can, by ensuring that both parties agree to the terms of the transfer before it's executed, by ensuring that transfers can only be executed on agreed terms, by ensuring that debtors always have liquidity cover for the transfers they execute. So creditors can always be completely confident that they will receive their funds in the process of settlement. We also want to shoulder the burden of efficient, low risk, no cost participation for small institutions. And that means we intend, the Mojaloop system intends to act as a constant standard for best practice in all areas of an IIPS. So we want to provide simple and effective ways for participants to act according to that best practice. So we do a lot of things that the existing institutions that use ISO 20022 don't need to do, because the individual people, they're large banks, they're credit card companies, they already know how to do all this sort of stuff. Our participants very often don't. So Mojaloop needs to be able to provide that support to them. Okay, so now we're going to move into the role play part. I scruffily am going to represent the Mojaloop system, and Julie, in her sophisticated way, is going to be the ISO 20022 system. So we're going to go through the various areas and start thinking about what our requirements are and find out from Julie what we would need to do in the ISO world to meet those requirements. So let's start with the discovery process. So I need to be able to associate an identifier with the financial institution that can execute credit for the person identified. That's the discovery process in Mojaloop. Julie, what can you do for me?
Yeah, So basically, like the concept of having a discovery phase, when you look at a traditional payment flow, we would need this is a part where potentially we would need some new type of message. But we can use already effectively we can piggyback of some of the initiatives that are, for example, existing in Europe, where you have some
cash management.
Yes, exactly.
CAM2.
And it's interesting because today it's going to be made mandatory in Europe to have IBAN name validation, and you have effectively lots of initiative where when you send an ID, this ID is being validated and enriched. Now, where I say we probably need some standard, if you look even across Europe of how they implement it, it's slightly different from one country to another. So this is where having some sort of more guidance from ISO would mean that everyone is implementing it the same way, which is not the case today.
Yeah, and I think it's probably fair to say that we are proposing to repurpose a message that wasn't originally intended, or a message set that wasn't originally intended to do what it is that we want to do. But we think there's space there to do it. So now I need to identify the financial institution which acts for a given identifier.
Yeah, so on this, we basically discussed this with Michael, and Nexus has been introducing this as well. But I think it's again coming back to my point around how do we make sure we are standard of doing this all across the industry, and that this standard is adopted. And at the moment, I do feel like this is work in progress, working with some global bank and seeing that the standards they need to implement is slightly different.
Thank you very much. Now I need to return information about that entity, including KYC information.
Yeah, so on that, effectively, as Michael mentioned on the slide, right, Nexus is a bit setting the way on what is the communication. And I think Ben mentioned it earlier that there is a sanction module within Nexus. So the idea would be to potentially leverage the same systems and communication mechanism.
So that's a kind of medium-sized tick on discovery. We can use existing messages, though they weren't originally purposed for what we want to do with them.
Yeah, I think again, I do agree with you when you say this is a medium-sized tick, because we need to make sure there is global adoption of this.
Yes. Okay, so let's move on to looking at agreement of terms. So I need to be able to propose the terms of a transfer.
Yeah, so effectively, and it's interesting when you say a payment is a payment. So we do have already some initiative in this space where before actually sending out a payment, the payments, all the conditions of the payment are being agreed between two parties, the payee and the payer, right? So the idea would be to potentially leverage this mechanism that exists in the name of PEN 013 and 14.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think one of the things we discussed with Michael is around, once you agree of the term of the payment, how do you make sure that the actual payment that will be generated is actually matched and linked up with the agreements of term. You need a unique identifier that's basically allowed to do the reconciliation between this agreement and the payment. Technically, there is already a field for this. So yeah, we need to discuss a bit more to see whether we can leverage this field. And when it comes to history of state, indeed, this is something that will need to be added. And the idea of adding a state would be for everyone to understand what is, in which state are we within the agreement of terms. Is it basically fully agreed, and then the transaction can be initiated and so on. And this is actually quite critical, because the same way that you are in a commercial negotiation, right? The agreement of term represents this. So there will be probably some back and forth to say, this is the FX rate, for example, do you accept it? This is a party, is that okay? And so on. So that's why understanding exactly at which states we are within the transaction is key.
Okay, so that sounds reasonable, fundamentally important. What can you offer me?
Yeah, and today this is there is actually like graphic log in the ISO2022 standard. However, I think that should be actually something that should be easy, because if you look at all the questions around security of transfer and so on, this is one of the key worry from the industry. So yeah, it will need to be added, but should be an easy add.
So as usual, we're leading the field. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah.
Excellent. So, okay, it sounds like we've got a slightly larger tick against that side of things. We think there are messages, they don't need very much training, and more or less they represent what it is that we want to do. So let's move on to execution. So I need to be able to execute a payment on the terms agreed. What can ISO do for me?
Yeah, so on this, like, you know, we have already basically like some fax messages existing. However, as Michael mentioned, like we will need probably to add some states, or actually when Michael and I discussed this earlier as well, like we would like to explore the existing purpose cause of a transaction for basically some of the requests. So we think it, yeah, probably can be done, and if not within the existing standard, again, that should be a field which should, like, you know, generate less argument against. Deciding how to act on that information is a matter for Mojaloop. Yeah, because depending on the information we would receive, this is where you want to basically confirm the settlement or not, and so on. So effectively, like, this is quite key for us to understand. When I say for us, I mean as Mojaloop institution, to understand like what is exactly the state of the payment, and whether, like, for example, the FX is settled so that the transaction can be executed.
So what we would do is produce a market practice document that says, this is how people should act in these states. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so now I need to return information about the outcome of the payment to the other parties.
And this already exists basically. Because, yeah, we have already Apex 2 basically that allow you to send a response to Apex 8. So
fantastic.
But yeah, we need to add again like the cryptographic keys, which is something we already discussed on the previous slide.
So that sounds like even bigger tick.
Yes.
We're getting towards quite a large tick here, aren't we?
Yeah, indeed.
Okay. So request to pay next. So I need to be able to ask an FI to initiate a payment. I'm conflating for these purposes, the more alert among you will have noticed, 3PPI and merchant request to pay, on the basis that they are essentially the same sort of thing as each other.
Yeah, and this again, like when you look at request to pay, you have already like some messages that does that. So it's about leveraging the existing standard and understanding if extra field needs to be added within the standard. And around the state of a payment, and how, like, for us, it's kind of critical in the flow to have transparency around the states, which is something that will need further analysis.
Yeah, I can tell. You can tell probably. Julie doesn't like that alternative much, but healthy debate. That's what we like. Okay, authorization then. How about that? I need to be able to ask for a financial institution to obtain an authorization I can trust from my customer.
Yeah, and I think on this is probably where we potentially need to look at a new set of message.
On the other hand,
yeah, indeed, it's coming back to the discussion of state and whether effectively we can use the existing standard but specify a special state saying actually this message is an authorization request. This, or again, purpose code could be something we could look at.
Patterns starting to emerge. I like history of states, usually doesn't. Okay, bulk transfers then. I need to be able to make single debit, multiple credit transfers using my standard transfer pattern.
This is already fully supported by ISO, basically.
Yeah, so all of the ISO payment messages are multiple credits by default. We may, however, need to restrict them in some ways. So for instance, ISO messages currently allow multiple debtor, multiple creditor messages.
Yeah, I think like in the way basically the Mojaloop system will create this bulk payment, we may need to implement some sophisticated bulk mechanism. So again, something to look at, but I think on this part, like as Michael just mentioned, it has nothing to do with the ISO committee. It's more like some rules that needs to be implemented within the Mojaloop world.
Yeah. Okay, currency conversion then. I need to be able to request a payment versus payment currency conversion in respect of a transfer.
Yes, so indeed, when it comes to currency conversion, per se, we don't have a set of messages. However, as we discussed in the past, we could potentially leverage like, a back rate and then use the concept of either state or again, like, purpose code to say, actually, this message is linked to a currency conversion.
So what you're telling me, Julie, is that we could add transfers to the existing payment message to represent the currency conversion, which is part of that message.
Yeah, indeed.
I thought that's what you were telling me. So the other point is I need to only execute the conversion if the transfer succeeds. Yeah,
so on this, like, again, we need to look at for me, it has nothing to do with ISO per se and so on. It's more like, rules within the Mojaloop and how we implement this. But yeah, we can discuss this further.
Okay. So that's a kind of medium-sized tick, I would say. Needs work. Third-party payment initiator association. So I need to be able to allow a third-party payment initiator, a PISP, to ask a financial institution to give permission for the 3PPI to make debit requests against a specific account. I need to allow the FI to satisfy itself that the customer's happy with this, and I need to set up an agreement between the two, which they can reference when a third-party payment initiator request to pay is received.
Yeah, so on this, like, yeah, you say we don't have messages per se, and I think that that's true, but I do think that we need to look at this a bit closer to see if potentially we can't use some existing mechanisms that exist in this space. So to be discussed.
Okay, TBD. So I think that's a kind of small cross that might turn into a tick. Ancillary stuff. So we need some changes to the existing message content. That contains things like unique identifiers that we've talked about before, things like that.
Yeah, so indeed, like, we need to make sure that our messages are inclusive. And I think, like, inclusive mean also, like, understanding what are the other type of initiative we're looking at, again, linking instant payment system and like implementing like new cross-border clearing per se, and then discuss with them on how actually we can align so that when we do a request for an additional field, we are not coming as a single voice, but we're coming at basically as a more industry request.
You ISO people are too good to us. So basically, I think we've covered all of the resources that the Mojaloop API currently needs to cover. And I think the answer is basically positive. We might need to do some work, but the number of new messages we require is actually turning out to be quite low if we concentrate our minds. So what will we need to do next? First of all, we need to work through in detail each of the use cases to make sure that we could meet Mojaloop's requirements with some modified content of existing ISO2022 messages. Second, we need to convert the result of that process into individual change requests. and possibly business justifications if, as Julie says, actual new messages are required. Finally, or sorry, not finally, we need to start submitting the individual requests to the payments standards evaluation group, which is the group that's responsible for those messages and will approve the changes. And we need to manage the coordination of the requests with each other. So that takes me to the end of this presentation. I think the thing that we are interested in is, first of all, the community's view on whether this is a productive approach and an approach worth taking. We have received a strong steer from the heads of the payment standards evaluation group and also from the chair of the registration management group, which is the overall approval group for ISO 20022, that this is the approach they would like us to take. In particular, they want us to break our requests down into small chunks and, where possible, manage it within the payment standards evaluation group. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we'll be looking for help, people to review proposals for how to work through the Mojaloop requirements in terms of the ISO messages, and in particular people to review in as hostile a way as they possibly can, and to find the, not of course that there will be any gaps in our proposal, but if there are, we need critical eyes to find them. So I think that's all I have to say.
Yeah, and I think, like, perhaps if I may add something again, like learning from short of the past and what happened with like the first few rounds of business justification, I think really like, and again, perhaps to insist of the key message is we've decided to change the approach. And the first step would be always to look at, is there a field that needs to be added or can be leveraged? And if not, go for a business justification. And even here, when we say first we'll do business justification, I think in a sequential event, we start with actually submitting individual requests and making sure as much as possible that these individual requests are aligned with other requests from the industry.
So does anyone have any questions or comments or offers of help?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Julie. That was actually
does anyone
the
have any
best
questions or
presentation.
comments? Mr.
Hello.
Haley.
Hello, can nobody hear me? Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry, more compliments, please.
Thank you. I was going to say, I can't see the room. I apologize. I'll be quiet.
Sorry, Paul.
Paul, can you hear us?
Go ahead.
I can.
you hear us?
Now. I'm not entirely sure you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. I was just going to say that's probably the best, most lucid description of ISO 222 integration that I've seen yet. So thank you to you both. I thought that was extremely good. I was just wanting to ask you what you think the timelines might be to get these responses to requests from the payments SEG. Do you think we're looking at months or years or what?
Months for the, well, again, it rather depends on how small we can get the change requests to be. The smaller the change request, the quicker it'll be processed. For reasonably simple change requests, or for change requests which are not perceived as requiring additional work by the other members, the other implementers of ISO 20022, they should be reasonably quick. And that would be, I think, a matter of months.
Yeah, indeed, Paul, and that also will depend on when exactly we initiate the request, because the committee work on specific cadence as well. So we need to make sure we align with this cadence so that, like, you know, when it comes to adding fields, we align to their timelines.
However, Jason Pollis, our man inside the ISO 20022 organization, will always be available to advise us on the best tactic to take. Thank you, Steve.
Okay.
No, you have no question.
I have another question. What we're doing is essentially making change requests based on what we think an IPA Have we been talking to any other IPS providers about coordinating requests on this in this area?
We've certainly been trying to. I have to say that it's not yet been terribly successful. We have interest from African Ender, who would like to get involved. We've been talking to the Nexus people, to Ben Dyson, because, as I think I said at various points, Nexus also wants to use existing ISO2022 messages where possible, though I think so far at least, they have drawn back from the idea that they would want to introduce new messages, even when they are clear that they have content that can't be managed by the existing message set. So we are ahead of them. Julie.
Yeah, Paul, I think to your point, like we discuss with other initiatives that are trying to link instant payment system, so that, like, you know, we can understand, like, whether they have similar requests. And for example, when it comes to FX and amount and so on, provided the level of transparency, with regard to the direction of travel of the market, should literally be something that everyone is looking for. So the short answer to your question is yes. Now, to Michael's point around, like, perhaps, like, why other organizations have not asked to add some fields. I think it depends very much on your approach. And I think when it comes to Mojaloop community, because of the nature of actors around the table, which are not necessarily 100% familiar with ISOs, that means we need to make sure of, you know, not implementing workaround that then becomes a new norm. And that's why, like, you know, I think for us, looking at actually including that into the standard is perhaps a tiny bit more key than other IPS.
I agree completely. I mean, we've certainly seen individual implementers who are using ISO messages. They just, I won't say cannibalize, but certainly make changes for themselves without referring those back to the standards organization. So effectively, it says ISO on the tin, but what's inside is not necessarily ISO.
Yeah, that's been exactly my experience as well. Yes. So, and that's why I was asking that question. Can we get other people on board?
Our intention is to be the good citizens.
Yeah.
In this area.
I think for me, like, you know, it's not, and sorry, I will disagree a bit with you. I'd say it's not related to good and bad citizen, right? It's relating to who is your audience, and what is basically the cost of rolling out new rules within the community and so on. And I think as part of Mojaloop, we want to make sure that we publish utility standard and so on that require minimum change as much as possible. So I think that's right.
Steve.
Just before we move off of that, I just want to say, as we have Grananda and the Gates Foundation, we are one brand of level 1 aligned institutions. There are other level 1 aligned IPSs out there in the world that are not using Mojaloop. I would ask that our friends who are doing level 1 aligned systems that are not using Mojaloop would bring in some of their projects to coordinate with you on this.
Absolutely. I mean, we've tried to reach out and ask where we can. It's just that they have their own things to do. So it's not always easy to get them to commit time to it.
And I think as well, like, you know, again, because I think the more supporter you have of a change request, the a yes answer is, like, you know, more probable. So I think even of some of the change that we're requesting, we could even look at some commercial proposal being launched as well, where they could, like, you know, face the same challenge. So indeed, I think, like, you know, part of the exercise over the coming period would be to communicate and, like, align a bit more with other level 1 or even beyond initiative.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Nope.
Nope.
In that case,
okay.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Julie. And now I'll hand over to, according to the schedule, Michael and Julie to talk about currency conversion.